In today's business environment, more and more companies are moving to virtual or hybrid events. While webinars and simple live streams are relatively easy, creating a virtual event that builds community and engages attendees and sponsors is a bit more complex. Introducing Vlink Events, a complete virtual event venue built to address the needs of event organizers, attendees, and sponsors. Let me show you how it works. Each event has a lobby to welcome attendees. By clicking on the registration desk, attendees can sign up for or log into the event. Once they've logged in, attendees have the ability to update their profile and see a complete directory of other attendees, and even chat with one another. The chat feature allows attendees to participate in various group chats around the venue. It also allows one-to-one chat via text, video, or even audio conversations. Check this out. When available, the group chat is found in the bottom right-hand corner. To join, just click Join the Discussion. To start a one-to-one chat, just click on the individual, and then to start a video or audio call, click on the appropriate icon. Attendees may need to allow the browser to access the video camera and microphone. Not all events are the same. Some may need a main stage or multiple breakout rooms, while others need a networking lounge or exhibit hall. Vlink's virtual venue has them all. This is the room navigation. Attendees just click on the room they want to go to. And once in that room, the room navigation is out of the way on the left-hand side. To go to a different room, you just click on the arrow and then select the next room you'd like to go to. The main stage and breakout rooms offer live or on-demand content options. They have audience polling, Q&A, speaker bios, and other functions easily accessible right below the video content. The Skyview Lounge is where networking takes place. To join a conversation, just click on the topic. This will then launch a video meeting via either Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Hangout, or other video conferencing solutions selected by the event organizers. The exhibit hall gives sponsors a virtual exhibit booth. Attendees can walk the exhibits, see a directory of all exhibits, or click on the map to visit a booth. Booths are designed so attendees can interact with the booth. They can find downloads or links to various web content, watch a video, or even start a conversation directly with the exhibitor via a video call. While nothing can replace a live in-person event, we think Vlink Events is setting a new standard for virtual events.
Thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks TAG for having us today. My name is Noelle London, and I am our ventures lead for Accenture for the South Market unit, so helping to connect our Fortune 500 and Fortune 2000 clients with startup partnerships. So we're here today to have a conversation about 2020 and the uncertain year that it's been. Some uncertainty around public health, around global economy, around issues of social justice, but also the opportunity that presents for organizations as we're thinking about how we want to build the organization that we want to work in and that we want to continue to impact. So today, as we think about 2020 and we think about the uncertainty that's brought, it's allowed organizations to think about their purpose moving forward, sometimes out of necessity. But an example of that is with Accenture recently, we released our new purpose statement focused on let there be change. So that's very fitting for today's conversation. One of the ways that I think we've seen this play out is within the talent and organization space. As companies are recovering from COVID-19, thinking about what their organization is going to look like beyond COVID-19, they're thinking about, how do I hire for surge solutions? How do I upskill and reskill around digital transformation? And how do I build that culture that is inclusive and innovative moving forward? So today we have some of Atlanta's best to help us with this conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our panelist to give us a brief introduction of who they are and what they're working on, and then we'll get to the heart of the conversation. So Mindy, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much, Noelle. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Mindy Scott, and I am an account executive at Civic Dinners. We are a platform that brings people together to have conversations that matter. So in this time where we're all working in different ways, and we know that diversity is so important, we want to create a space where everybody has a voice. And, basically what we do is we help to create a more inclusive world where everyone feels invited and engaged to co-create a better future.
Great. Romeen?
Yeah, thanks, Noelle, and thanks everybody for joining. My name is Romeen Sheth. I lead an organization called Metasys Technologies, and we help enterprise organizations think through their workforce solutions. So we work with companies on their non-full-time talent, and we work with them in a variety of ways to really make sure that they're well positioned for future work. My background is I come to Metasys from McKinsey & Company, where I spent a lot of time thinking about future of work, working with CHROs and CFOs on how to most effectively think about your talent going forward. So pleasure to be here and excited to chat.
All right. And then Namita?
Thank you, Noelle. Pyramid and TAG have had a long-standing relationship in Atlanta market. Pyramid is a company that is focused on bringing diversity into workspace. I am the Chief Customer Officer, co-owner of the company, have been at it for 25 years now. So truly trying to bring contingent labor and talent to the organization, and that too with the conversations changing, making sure that we can bring in diverse talent to the companies. We are working on some of the programs that I'd like to talk about to help customers, bring that business imperative of truly being diverse and inclusive in their workplaces, and how we can support them is what I would like to talk about. Thanks, Noelle, for including us. Happy to be here.
Great. All right. So kicking off the conversation, so we're talking about inclusive and innovative culture and how we build that within our organizations. I think what would be helpful is setting the stage with what are the pillars of this inclusive and innovative culture. When we're talking about this, what do we mean? Romeen, I'm actually going to have you start with this. If you can tell us what are the pillars and what does this mean to you?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Noelle. When I think of the question, I think there are a couple elements to what you just said, right? There's inclusion, there's innovation, but fundamentally both inclusion and innovation go hand in hand at the root level. At its core, innovation is nothing but creatively combining all different kinds of knowledge, right? And the scope and combinations of knowledge can vary dramatically. When you think about individual organizations and their competitive advantage in markets, these advantages can result from packaging knowledge in a unique way or reformulation of a specific idea, or more broadly, it can come from rethinking an entire landscape. I have a good friend who actually has a really elegant framework on how to think about innovation, and I'll share it with this group. It's a very simple 2x2 matrix. And on one vertical or on one side, it's problems. So is this an old problem or is this a new problem? And on the other side, it's solutions. Are we going to apply an old solution or a new solution? And I think innovation comes from that intersection. So for example, if you had to store cryptocurrency, that's a new problem, but you might use a traditional online vault, which is an old solution, right? Or if you need to get from point A to B, it's an old problem, but you might use a new solution like Uber to get there. So innovation to me, it's fundamentally packaging knowledge in a way that exposes an insight or relevance in your market. Now on the inclusion side, in my experience, what I found is that the success of organizations and teams have in exposing that insight is fundamentally executing against a deep appreciation for inclusion, right? Inclusive teams are the ones that are best suited and best positioned to really drive innovation in organizations. And when I think of inclusion, I think about two kinds. One is, inherent diversity, right? The traits that you're born with. Do we have teams that are made up of, different gender composition, ethnicity, so on and so forth? And then I think there's acquired diversity. I think there's the mechanics in your organization that really establish a culture where employees feel, open and able to contribute ideas. Inherent diversity is really critical. I mean, it's been shown study after study that having diversity of ethnicity, gender, et cetera, have better bottom line performance. And it makes a ton of sense, right? Increasingly, our communities, our partners, are more representative of different types of folks. But acquired diversity is equally critical, right? And having a number of practices like, open forums, giving team members decision-making authority, et cetera, is really important to bring out the best in folks. So, ultimately, I'm a firm believer that innovation and inclusion really go hand in hand. And innovation culture, to me, is a function of packaging knowledge in a unique way. And then inclusion is really about executing against that knowledge packaging. So that's a little bit about how I think about the pillars.
Great. So there is, and I would actually ask you this, Mindy. So you all at Civic Dinners are really helping organizations to have the hard conversations, helping to facilitate, and that facilitation process is a really important part of this, of making an environment where people are comfortable to have these conversations. Tell me a little bit about, when you're thinking, there are different philosophies of culture, of inclusive innovation. Are there any non-negotiables when people are having this conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one of the biggest non-negotiables is that these conversations shouldn't happen. I think that they should. I think just leaning in, taking the action, and really building those pillars that support the values of your company. I just think that that's so important, because I'd like to also build on everything that was just said, because that was so beautiful and eloquent about, innovation and inclusion. I mean, they really do go so hand in hand. And we see so many companies building ROIs and really focusing on diversity, but, you're not going to reap the benefits of diversity if you don't have inclusion. So a quote that I really like from Verna Myers, she says that diversity is being invited to a party, inclusion is being asked to dance. So I just think that's a really beautiful way of kind of showing, you can have a diverse room, you can have a diverse workforce, but if you're not giving them the tools to be heard and to be a part of the conversation, you won't get those benefits that lead to amazing innovation from different perspectives. So what we do by bringing people together, and what we encourage companies to do, is to have those conversations. We actually have a great conversation on inclusive culture. And I think that's one of the biggest non-negotiables, I would say, is just when companies think that, well, maybe we should wait. Maybe this isn't for the workplace. We have a great platform, great conversations and strategies that take any of that pressure and hesitancy off of the companies, because we've created everything for them. So we've created the conversations. People don't have to be as worried about if they say the wrong thing. They can then be the facilitators who really help to bring people together, which builds those bonds that lead to amazing inclusion and innovation.
And Namita, on the other side of the coin, so you're helping to place people into positions with Pyramid Consulting. Any non-negotiables for you? Anything in particular that you're thinking about when you're thinking about how to help find positions and find places that may be more inclusive and innovative?
Thank you, Noelle, for that question. In our business, that's what we do, right? Place people, find them their jobs. What I feel is non-negotiable is, one, the assessment of your own self, right? The unconscious bias is something that we are all carrying in our hearts, and we showcase them in many different ways, right? So one of the non-negotiable for me is the training around the unconscious bias, and how or what practices can be put. Again, putting words out there is really step one, right? Acknowledging that we do all are born with it. We have it, some more than the others in a cultural setup or in a corporate setup. But acknowledgement of that, assessment of that, and then putting some steps to remove that, or at least reduce that. Creating diverse panels while hiring is happening. Ensuring that you have a diverse slate of candidates to choose from. The ERGs that you have internally for your culture. So one of the non-negotiable is the acknowledgement of the unconscious bias and doing something about it. And then what I have seen also is, on the second hand, is there has to be leadership buy-in. You have to have leaders buy in into the thought process or shifting the culture. if that is what the intention is for the corporations. A lot of commitments coming in from the CEO levels, right? I mean, as we have seen in the last 6 months, so many commitments. LinkedIn, we open the LinkedIn and there's a new commitment from a large company CEO. But how is that money flowing, resources flowing? So providing enough resources to actually make that systematic change is something very important. It's not negotiable. If we cannot just say that we'd like to do this, but not have enough resources to get it done, right? So to me, these are the two factors: leadership buy-in and acknowledging that there is unconscious bias, and we have to do something about, steps to remove it.
Mindy, it looks like you were raising your hand on that one.
I didn't. I loved what Namita said, and she actually made me think of something else that I think is really important is when these conversations are happening, because Namita's so right. A lot of times they're coming from the CEO. I think it's really important to include voices at all levels, and especially including voices for those that we are trying to make sure we're saving space to hear, because I think oftentimes companies may not be as diverse at the top as where their goals are trying to take them. So making sure that you are actually hearing from people that we are trying to include, different minorities. And I just think that that's really important when we're building these processes out.
Yeah, absolutely. Romeen, any thoughts that you have on this?
Yeah, and I really like the way that both Namita and Mindy answered. And Noelle, you framed the question. When I think of this, and I kind of think of non-negotiables when building an inclusive and innovative culture, especially when differences on opinions might exist, I think it gets pretty nuanced, right? So the way I like to think about it is difference of opinion it's critical in developing an innovation culture, right? You can't have an innovation culture if you don't have difference of opinion. But if that difference of opinion isn't bounded with a coherent and cogent value set, it can be in direct opposition to an inclusive culture. So I'll take kind of a step back. When I think of some of the most successful technology organizations in the world, I think there's a fundamental alignment around core values. And what I mean by this is, if we take a look at the strongest innovation organizations, they're laser focused on a key mission. So let's think about companies like Uber, Tesla, Airbnb, et cetera, right? Uber's sole mission is let's unlock global transport, right? Tesla's sole mission is let's unlock effective energy utility, right? Airbnb is similar, right? Let's have a differentiated travel experience. It's impossible to build an innovative organization that has a difference of opinion on what the organization is actually solving for, or what everybody is coming to the table to solve for. That's something that everybody can feel inclusion around, right? The whole organization, the whole entity, whatever it might be, we're fundamentally oriented around solving the same goal. But inclusive culture to me is one that fosters, embraces, actively encourages difference of opinion, not difference of core values, right? We encourage vigorous and fierce debate, especially in a quest to get to the truth, right? Because inclusive cultures ultimately are the ones in which everyone's voices, should be heard. And one of the organizations I was a part of before leading Metasys, we had a value which I love, and I bring with me to Metasys, and will bring to me with every organization I'm at, is this concept of the obligation to dissent. And the reason we had that value, the thought process behind it was there was whenever anybody had a meeting, or a group or team had a meeting, one person had the responsibility to basically find a difference of opinion, not out of necessarily their own belief or so, but they had the obligation to dissent. And the point there was, if we're not pushing each other to find the truth, if we're not pushing each other to debate and dissent on these ideas, how do we bring out the best ideas? But at the end of the day, after we've had that vigorous, fierce debate and exchange, thought processes and so on and so forth, even if you disagree, you have to commit, right? And to me, that's ultimately what, what the non-negotiable, what that tether is that there has to be, specific focus, specific directionality, specific intentionality around the direction that we're going in. But the inner workings and the inner pathways to get, what the best mechanic on that path is, absolutely has to be open, to debate, discussion, et cetera, to have the most inclusive culture. So that's kind of how I think about it.
There are a lot of good nuggets in there, I think, across the board. One, making sure you're having the conversation. We're not getting anywhere if we're not having the conversation. Two, making sure that you are equipping your teams as much as possible with things like trainings, and making sure that we're paying attention to the organizations and kind of who is where across that organization, and then making sure that we're holding ourselves accountable by this idea of dissent, and just making sure that we're asking the right questions, because these are really complex issues. So we need to make sure that we're asking those questions. So those are all helpful tidbits. So thanks for sharing. One thing that we talked about, we got the chance to.
I wanted to add something. What I wanted to add was that, having people accountable, right? Even though we are working from home, right? I mean, having to ensure that the teams are accountable for not necessarily metrics driven, because we're not there yet, right? We can't just put a label that we'll do 70% diverse hiring. I mean, it's an internal metric, but really having teams accountable for their actions is something that's important to me and non-negotiable, right? I mean, as I said, the CEO level commitment is great, but how does it permeate the organization down where the hiring is happening? For me, the case in point is that I actually run a business under the Pyramid Consulting umbrella called Pyramid Academy, which trains, trains, deploy underrepresented minorities, women, and African Americans, Latinos, for early career resources into IT. So that it sounds really good, right? It is a business imperative for us to be able to do good with them, for us, our business, and for our customers to really give them a vehicle to increase their diversity and diverse spending. But when it actually comes down to the hiring practices, they like to see what they've hired from before. They like their own talent pools. They're not being pushed to actually consider new talent pools. And so that is where my challenge is that, talk comes easy, right? Actually really holding these teams accountable when they are in the hiring practices. That's important to me, that there's definitely some accountability on their end, that what are they looking at? How are they being, looking at this as being a little bit more unconsciously biased towards some of their talent pools and friends and family and all that, to go outside that comfort zone. So I think that's important to me, is the teams to be accountable for their actions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like, Namita, that you brought that up, because yesterday we had the chance to get us together just to meet each other before today. And one of the things that we brought up was this idea of building culture into your strategy. So is this something that is, an add-on, building inclusive and innovative culture, or is it something that has to be woven into the fabric of your strategy? I'd love to kind of open this up to this group, whoever wants to jump in on this one. But how are we weaving inclusive and innovative culture into the fabric of the company, into the purpose of the company?
That's a great question. And I think it has to kind of be a little bit of both, being a part of those values and also being a part of the strategy. So something, when you mentioned our conversation before, something that was shared from Romeen and Namita, they were talking about how developing relationships, especially now in this time where we are distance, people are working from home, that can be really challenging. So you have a few different reasons for this push, as we've seen with social justice movements, as we've seen with the pandemic. So the time is now. So even if it's not necessarily in your values, you can still add that, but building it into your strategies so it becomes a cultural value, I think, is equally as important. And it's something that's really needed right now.
This is a tough one, because, companies, we all know what the strategic visions for the companies are. They put it down, right there, and they review it every 3 to 5 years, right? That's the strategic vision. But companies forget that culture has to be part of that decision making, and the culture of the company also needs to be reviewed along with strategy. So I have seen where companies collapse because they only have the strategic vision was clear, but the cultural vision, or where how to bring people along with them was not. So seen it, sometimes we see it internally as well. So that is where we are focused on as a company. How do we, the social unrest really heightens it, right? I mean, we have had a very extensive diversity journey as a company. We are a diverse supplier certified through NMSDC. But how do we evolve with our strategies? Every 2 to 3 years, we put these strategies together, but how are we evolving our people culturally as well is an important part, or how do we have them see the vision both from the top all the way where the work is getting done. So that's some of the exercises that we are doing, that we are reviewing. And, culture is not a review. It's really there. It's permeating, right? I mean, it's easier when you're in the office. It makes it even harder to build that culture working from home. So that's definitely been a challenge. But, having open doors, right? I mean, at the time when we all felt, having those open communications, honest and open communications from the CEO level all the way down is something. And then, truly showcasing where they want the company to be, the leaders have to be, and what can all of us do at our own levels, right? To be able to work towards that vision is important. Making sure that the leadership looks diverse, right? I mean, so creating that pipeline of female executives is important. Showcasing, right? Practicing what you preach is very important to me. I mean, leadership has to look the way they want the organization to look. So that's important to me, that we are changing some of that consciously. So it's an intentional objective around. We did start a movement called Intentionally Inclusive, which is about looking at our own practices and how are we able to, bring in slate of diverse candidates for ourselves and for our customers. So that's been important. What I would say is that they do go hand in hand. You cannot just talk about strategy and leave the culture behind, because they have to be reviewed together, because they go together.
And Namita, I love something you said there about, that opportunity to lead at everyone's own level. And I think that really just kind of also lifts up the importance of this, because that's something that so many companies want, but people don't feel included and ready to jump in if you don't have that inclusive, diverse culture. Because if somebody, sees something differently, they might keep it to themselves, but it could be the best innovation for the company, or something that could be really strategic and helpful. So, we all want to feel included. Inclusion is really that central part of self-worth, and that ability for our employees to participate in our company at all levels. So I just wanted to add that on there.
It's interesting the way you guys have framed it. I think they absolutely do go hand in hand. There's this quote. I think Noelle, you and I were talking about this the other day. There's this quote that culture eats, strategy for breakfast.
I was worried I was going to say it in the wrong order, so thanks for
and this might be controversial, but I actually really don't like that quote. I think it's fundamentally flawed. The quote to me presupposes the importance of one over the other. Look, you can have the best culture in the world with terrible strategy. I mean, I'd argue that, when I get together with friends over the weekend and we're watching a football game, it's fantastic culture, but there's no strategy there, right? You can have, on the flip side, and I think this is what the quote kind of gets to is the more canonical example is you can have great strategy, et cetera, but if you have a terrible culture, you can't execute, right? Which makes a ton of sense. I think the right way to think about it is actually, how do these two elements go in hand in hand? I have a framework that I really like to use to kind of dissect, the importance of both of these, and it's called the equation for change, which is basically, when you think of change, or you think of, culture, strategy, innovation, all those things, right? Fundamentally at its core, right? When you're building an inclusive culture, when you're having innovation, you're fundamentally trying to change something in the world, right? So the question becomes, what are the components that really allow you personally as a team and as an organization to effectively maneuver change? And I think it comes down to 5 things, right? One is vision, which is your canonical kind of strategy, right? The second is skills, actually surrounding yourself with the right people that can actually do the right things. The third is incentives, making sure that they're in the right structural setting. The fourth is resources, making sure that they not only have the people that they need, but also the additional, non-human resources to get the work done. And then the fifth is an action plan, right? And the compelling part of that framework is actually, if you're missing any one out of those five, it leads to a different emotion, right? So I'll give an example. If you have, vision, skills, incentives, resources, but you don't have any action plan, you kind of have a false start, right? Like you're right there at the line, but you're not actually able to get going. If you have, the flip side, if you have skills, incentives, resources, and action plan, but you don't have any vision, you just have a bunch of people that are confused, right? You don't actually know what direction you're going in. And so I like to think about, I really like the way Namita and Mindy framed it, but I really like to think about when people talk about innovation, strategy, inclusion, right, et cetera, I like to think about it in that framework, which is if you don't have all five of those components, it leads to some sort of emotion that's not going to quite get you there. But the idea or kind of the presupposition of, one is more important than the other, I think is a bit of a false equivalence. So that's kind of how I think about those elements.
Somebody mentioned, it may have been you, Namita, mentioned the working from home piece and how that's shifting this as well. I think for the last few years, we've been thinking about office spaces. How do we create, open kitchens so that people serendipitously meet over coffee, and that's where the innovation happens. Thinking about co-creation spaces, and we've been kind of tapping into this physical element to create innovative culture, to create an inclusive culture where, people have access to leaders because you're bumping into each other. What does this mean for working from home as we're having more organizations talking about working remotely permanently? How do we continue to create these environments when we're from home and on these kinds of Zoom calls? I'm going to open that one up. It looked like Mindy, you're jumping in.
I would be happy to jump in. I mean, that's what, at Civic dinners, that's really what we do. We, like most companies, had to make some pivots once everything happened and we were all working from home. We were originally focused on bringing people together in person as well. But what we found is exactly that, like that humanization piece. We really still need that. When you feel comfortable with someone, you're ready to share those ideas. You're ready to bring your authentic self. So how do you do that when you're not around the water cooler or the lunchroom, as you say? And that's why Civic dinners exist, essentially. We can help companies. We come in and they can facilitate conversations, these meaningful, tough, sometimes conversations that are very necessary through coffee connects. They can do them during the lunchtime. We also have some happy hour options just to bring people together, because you're so right. That builds into a strong company, strong organization, and is incredibly crucial to the development of staff, of trust, of relationships. So yeah, we do that in all sorts of different ways in working with our corporate partners.
Yeah, it's so important. I think if you take a step back, obviously we're in the midst of a global pandemic, but the implications of that are tough on people, right? I mean, we're seeing more burnout, we're seeing more isolation, frankly, more dual responsibility than ever before. I mean, the statistics for working women are horrible, right? In terms of how many additional hours, people are putting in addition to, their normal kind of day job. When I think about it as a leader of an organization, I think now's really the time for companies to double down on culture, right? I mean, it requires extra proactivity in making an effort, but with the fluidity and flexibility to respect personal space. So I think, I heard this a lot from kind of peer CEOs when we were starting out with COVID was, people in leadership had great intent of like, we want to create these inclusive spaces. We want to create, Noelle, the way you were framing it, kind of that virtual, coffee, area, right? That open kitchen, that virtual kind of zone where people can get together. But I think the flip side of taking that too far is kind of enforce Zoom happy hours, enforce all hands, enforce this. and it can get exhausting, right? And it can, and so I think it has to be that balance of really, respecting, folks' personal space. And ultimately, I think the way that you design for that type of culture, whether it's a remote world or an in-person world, but I think especially in a remote world, as we're all kind of learning how to navigate the waters, is solving for trust, right? And so establishing trust between yourself and your team is so important. I mean, it's the foundation for where all of these inclusive practices live, and a critical component for building trust, I think, is creating space, for people to express themselves, where they can be vulnerable and where they can show up as they need to. So a lot of what we've been encouraging our leaders internally to do is, just have open conversations with the team, and a guiding principle that we have, overtly stressed kind of on a week in, week out basis is don't make assumptions for anyone's situation, right? Some people can appear that they don't have other demands on their time. Some might appear that they can brush things off, or not let, things affect them. It's a tough time, right? It's a tough time for everyone. It's a tough time for businesses. And in a remote setting, we don't get nearly as many cues about someone truly showing up to the conversation, right? I mean, when you think about an in-person dynamic, there's so many small cues of things like closing your laptop, physically leaning into the conversation, keeping your arms crossed or uncrossed. There's all these nonverbal cues, and they're gone, right? I mean, they're gone in a remote world. I mean, how many conversations have we all been a part of where people actually don't even turn their video on because there's Zoom fatigue, right? And so even those remote, verbal cues are gone. So I think the biggest thing when I think about it, I always like to separate kind of tactics and foundation. And I think tactics are the quick fixes or the quick hits, or can we throw a Zoom happy hour? Can we kind of, take what was working in a physical environment and try to just find the corollary? And I think the deeper work and the tougher question is, how do you build that culture of trust? And I think, one at least mechanic or pragmatic way to go about that we found in our organization that's really worked well is really encouraging, that openness of conversation and really fighting down that self-urge of assumption. It's a natural human instinct, right? It's not a bad quality. In fact, the flip side of it is having those assumption sets is great because it drives instinct, right? But in a remote type world, a lot of the time what we've had to do is really kind of fight that urge on the assumption side. But it's tough, Noelle. It's not an easy thing by any means.
I would just love to build on that real quick, because I love what you said there about vulnerability. And, I think sometimes it's easy for companies, because I previously worked in corporate America, and I remember this as well, to just, okay, well, we hear all of our teams are going through this, so let's have a town hall. Let's bring everybody together. And, sometimes in those situations, you miss still hearing from people, which is what you're trying to get in building those relationships. So, Romeen, I love when you were talking about creating that vulnerable, safe space. And, that's obviously something we really believe in at Civic Dinners, and we try to help take those hesitancies out of it. Because I think too, when you were talking about assumptions, sometimes leaders can be afraid, they might say the wrong thing. So that's why we try to create this safe space through our prepared conversations. And then that builds trust so you can have more open conversations as well, because you're so right. It's those small groups that really have impact and can create that overall trust.
Namita, you are on
So what
mute.
I will add here is that, managers and leaders have added responsibility today for the well-being of their teams. So everybody is, again, accountable for their organization at every level, right? So they have to make sure that their teams are the well-beings of their teams, right? And give them some personal space, acknowledge that there is more work around. All of us are working harder and longer hours, right? That acknowledgement has to be there. So enforcing situations such as, Zoom wine tastings and good. Some people are motivated through that, right? So continue doing that. Whoever, it's not a necessity for you to, when it becomes that I have to be there, that's a pain. But some people may like, this wine tasting. Other people are more motivated towards, physical challenges, right? Having that yoga class or doing, we've been running a contest internally about, the Vibha running and the walks. We're all signed up with all the Fitbits, right? So some people are motivated for that. Again, it is something that is an offer, right? But it is not something that they have to do, right? So we, as an HR and leaders, we have to provide the teams, various experiences and let them choose, right, where they want to connect and who do they want to connect with. So that's what we've been doing, is being able to offer them, multitude of things to be able to come in a smaller setup. Bigger setups are also important. Mindy, I know that you mentioned about that, but clear communication from the leadership is extremely important at this point of time, right? I mean, we also, I think another thing that has helped is that we have actually made Thursday afternoons as meeting-free day. I mean, no meetings will be set up on Thursday, starting noon to 5 internally. I mean, obviously people have their sales meeting, customer meetings and all, that's for them to manage. But so the CEO has blocked all the calendars from Thursday through noon to 5 to, give people time back. They can do their own job. They can do some learning. We've also been able to provide them some courses that they can upskill and reskill themselves in through the Udemy courses. So this is also a time for reflection, mental satisfaction, looking after the kids. We're all doing multiple jobs. Once I was telling Romeen, there's a big event happening, and we would have actually been out of the house for 4 days. Right. And then, that's the only one job I'm doing. But here at home, there are many jobs that you are expected to do, right? I mean, you will connect on virtually, whatever you can do, but you have to take the dog out, you have to cook the dinner, right? All of those things are part of still. So we're doing many things in a day. And so I think giving free time back, having a Friday off to the employees, right? Take 1 day off in a month and just do whatever you need to do. You don't have to report to work. Has really worked well in bringing that culture together. That we think about their mental health, and it's important that they take care of their families, because if you don't bring that to the table, work doesn't get done. You have to be mentally and the family side have to be strong there to be able to bring your very best to work. So these are some of the strategies we've been working on, but as Romeen said, it's been challenging. There is so much of virtual fatigue. I'm kidding. I don't want another Zoom meeting happening but it's a need of the hour. So that's what we're doing. But creating smaller experiences for people is where I think has helped.
That's great. There's so many pieces of good information in there. I really liked the don't make assumptions. Everybody wants to participate in culture building activities differently. So keeping that in mind, I think, is really helpful. It looks like we only have time for one more question, and we'll keep this one brief because I know you all have more of these Zoom calls to get to. But just, closing us out, we're seeing so many announcements right now around inclusion and diversity. And that's a step in the right direction. It's been interesting. My boss, Kathy Ross, has launched a Black Founders Development Program with Accenture. And she says, her work is done when we don't need announcements about, a new Fortune 500 leader in the headlines. So I think, coming out of this, is there, one piece of advice that you would want the listeners to take away around how do we leverage this momentum and this very, very important moment that we're in to leverage that momentum to create long-term change? Big question, not a lot of time, but what's one takeaway that you would want to share?
So let me begin that, momentum is good. Momentum can impact business as well. So we don't want to lose this momentum, right? Creating the momentum is already there, using it to our advantage to really put us out there to create the vision and continue putting those resources and time to gain what we are, we have the end goal. We have to understand that, this has been around with us for 400 years. It's not going to go away tomorrow. These discussions, but this is now the time is that we actually have momentum. So we don't want to, misuse it, really put that momentum to have a business impact. So So talk about it enough, right? The momentum, we have to continue talking about it. I know that, we talked about that many organizations are making commitments, so we have to continue to talk about it. Unless and until we get there. And then there are several steps, right? You have to give resources and time to that. You have to have some cultural shift change, right? Whatever you need to do in the end. But I think if we have the vision where we want to be, and we can use this momentum to actually, propel us in the right direction. So continue the conversation. Momentum is great. We don't want to miss it.
Yeah, Noelle, I think it's one of the most encouraging things I'm seeing candidly right now. A lot of companies have very candidly paid lip service to diversity and inclusion for years. It's a nice tagline, it's a nice slogan, but for some reason it just doesn't quite make it into the practical application or execution. I don't think that's an accident, by the way, right? I think the silver lining of some of the absolutely unfortunate circumstances that have happened in our society over the past 6 months is I'm really actually seeing conviction and commitment to diversity and inclusion in a way that I haven't seen before. I think when you get to the takeaway or kind of what is that nugget though, which is the core of your question, I think the imperative on our organizations, we're also a diverse organization like Namita's and like Mindy's as well. They're a women-owned organization, so diversity is not just, ethnicity as well. I think the imperative on our organizations is to keep inculcating these initiatives that we're providing in clear business cases, right? Diversity, even though we've talked about a bunch of great points in this conversation, there's so many studies that show it's better for the bottom line. But diversity has this weakness, I would say, which is, getting wrapped in kind of the soft win bucket, right? I think all of us on this call believe in actually the hard dollar kind of impact, right? The quantitative impact of diversity. That's not the majority of people. The majority of people find diversity to be in that qualitative soft win bucket. I think the only way that we actually see long-term and permanence of some of these actions that we're seeing in the corporate community is actually by wrapping any initiative that we're targeting, into a proper business case. But that being said, I'm candidly I'm encouraged. I think the best days for diversity and inclusion really are in the future. And I'm sure I speak, both for Namita and Mindy in saying that, we're all looking forward actually to contributing to that better future, right? I think the onus is as much, actually, it's a two-way conversation and a two-way street. I think the imperative is as much on us as organizations, as it really is from some of these corporations that are putting forth the responsibility.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, honestly, I feel like you covered all the bases there, but I would just say I am too encouraged. We are seeing a lot of companies truly buying into this because I think it's so important to not just talk about it. Namita, I think you mentioned it's also important to listen. We've talked about that so that you're giving that opportunity, making sure that you're actually hearing from your employees and you're doing what's best for them. Obviously, having a strong business case, building those ROIs, we know how important that is, and it can be done. It's just you need the momentum, the effort, and the focus behind it. So don't lose sight of that momentum. Obviously, there's companies like ours at Civic Dinners that can help you in those ROIs and achieving those things. And maybe you already have the people internally to do that. So just stay with it, do it. I too am very encouraged, and we're heading in the right direction.
Wonderful. Well, I am very encouraged speaking with all of you today as well. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been great. And thanks for tuning in. And thanks to TAG for having us.